Erik Prince, the businessman behind the private security firm Blackwater, has a strategy to get the United States out of Afghanistan, hand over the conflict to his new company. Prince wants to use his private army to support Afghan forces. He even pitched the idea to the Trump administration. He says the proposal will save lives and cost a fraction of what Washington is currently spending. Prince also believes Afghanistan's rare earth minerals could pay for the entire operation. Well, joining me now from occupied East Jerusalem is journalist Antony Loewenstein. He's published an investigative piece on Erik Prince's Afghanistan proposal. It's available at trtworld.com. Antony, thank you very much indeed for your time. Why is this so controversial, considering actually the Afghan war has been partially privatized already?
Well, there's no doubt that since the US invaded in October 2001, the war has been partly privatised, and the effect of that on civilian lives has been devastating. However, what Erik Prince is trying to do here is even worse. What he's trying to do is two things. One, privatise the war. He claims that thousands of private mercenaries can essentially do what the US military has not been able to do in 17 years of war. It's the longest war in US history. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of Afghan forces dying every week in this war. The Taliban has never been more powerful. But the other part of this story, which I investigated for TRT, as you say, was Prince has plans to try to exploit the country's resources. He has the Trump administration behind him. All of this is done covertly, I might add. He wants to try to exploit lithium and gold and rare earths in a diluted plan to be able to somehow profit, obviously, for his own company, but also what he claims is to give Afghan jobs. But this sort of plan, having spent time in Afghanistan, meeting some of these communities who would be affected, it would worsen violence, not make it any better.
Do we know what Donald Trump thinks about this? We know, don't we, that the Pentagon has said this is definitely not a good idea. But what about the president and his close advisors?
Well, Trump himself has not commented about Prince, but what he has done is spoken very openly and positively about the idea of exploiting the country's resources. What Trump has said since he's become president is contradictory in typical Trump style. On the one hand, he says basically, why is the US still in Afghanistan? And I would argue that's a very fair question. However, he's still sending more troops, and he's certainly open to the idea of privatising part of the war, even more so, and potentially exploiting its resources. So in the last year or so, in 2017, we know he met a number of private companies in the US who are open to doing that. When Prince went to Afghanistan this year, in January and September, as my reporting shows, he was going, quote, as Trump's advisor. That was what the security company that Prince used claimed Prince was there as. In other words, he was doing almost like an unofficial job to support what Trump believed in. So Trump, I think, believes the US could stay in Afghanistan if American companies could make money from the war. So Afghan civilians, of course, are caught in the middle and would suffer hugely if his plan came to fruition.
It sounds a bit counterintuitive to say that there's a military presence in Afghanistan to ensure peace. Do you get any sort of sense that Prince has an idea about how his private army might bring peace to Afghanistan? Or, if you're having very dark thoughts, you may believe that actually it would suit his purposes for war to continue.
Well, look, Prince himself has spoken openly about how he believes that privatising the war would somehow end the war, beat the Taliban, and the US can walk away with its head held high. But the truth is that that would completely not be based on any kind of fact. Any Afghan you speak to, and I speak to Afghans in Afghanistan constantly, are petrified of this idea because violence against civilians has never been worse. And in fact, many of the areas where private mercenaries have been operating in Afghanistan since October 2001, either run by Americans or Afghans, violence in fact has got worse. And some of the most disturbing parts of what I reported about Prince's plans to try to exploit the country's resources shows that the areas where he would like to exploit minerals, including both his own company and others, are often controlled by the Taliban or ISIS. So the idea somehow that you're going to have to use private militias or pay off warlords to somehow access these areas is completely delusional. And yet, as you rightly ask, is that what Prince actually wants? At the moment, Trump has rejected the plans to privatise the war so far. that might change, and many people in Afghanistan are hoping that it does not change. But certainly Trump seems very open to the idea of privatising the resources, and in fact Afghanistan has got anywhere between 1 to 4 trillion US dollars of resources under the ground. It's a huge wealth, but arguably, as anyone who spent time in Afghanistan will tell you, exploiting those resources is going to make the war a lot worse. So Prince's plan should definitely be questioned and rejected, as the Ghani government has currently done in Afghanistan, although other forces within the Afghan government seem much more open to his ideas.
Has Prince thought through any of the legal issues here? Imagine if that private army were to commit any crimes, if, God forbid, it was involved in any extrajudicial killings. What if civilians are killed in a fight just being nearby a conflict that involves those troops? What would happen in that case?
Well, the truth is that since September 11, of course, we've seen many wars privatised. Iraq, Afghanistan, parts of the Syrian war and elsewhere. And the truth is that private mercenaries operate in a sort of legal-free zone. There really has been little to no accountability for US mercenaries, Australian mercenaries, British mercenaries operating. There are a few cases of a few legal trials in the US and elsewhere of private mercenaries being held to account, but in the vast majority of cases they're not. So an individual might commit a crime, kill somebody, torture someone in Afghanistan or Iraq, and they're often then taken out of the country back to the US and often protected. There are, as I said, a few examples where former Prince colleagues from Blackwater, the company he founded, had been put on trial in the US for committing war crimes in Iraq. But even then, the trial has lasted for many years without any real concrete conclusion. So the truth is Prince knows that this was happening long before Trump came into power, and now with Trump as US president, he really has no, I think, qualms about putting forward a proposal where his forces would be protected just by virtue of the fact that it's Erik Prince. It's a very worrying development.
Antony Loewenstein, we appreciate the contribution. Thank you very much.